You're listening to the Talking Headways podcast network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week I'm joined once again by Laurel Paget-Seekins of Public Advocates. Laurel discusses transit agency power dynamics, loss of public sector capacity, and how the administration is looking to gut civil rights enforcement mechanisms for transportation projects. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super amazing and kind Patreon supporters. We appreciate you all keeping this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire going. To join this merry band of subway crayonistas and city smarties, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note sent with a cool train station stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scars. And if you want to just give a single dollar a month, you'll be able to get the podcast with zero outside ads or podcast recommendations in Patreon. We'll leave information in the show notes about how to do it and how to get it into your podcatcher. We've also recently put up some bonus material and have weekly free posts from our newsletter intro, so check it out if you haven't already. And speaking of scarves, it's still winter, so get your heavyweight bus or bike scarves. You definitely need one for you, your friends, your colleagues, and for the anti-bus activists you just want to frustrate. If you want to get one of the bus or bike scarves or the lightweight bike scarf for hot climates, visit theoverheadwire.com or support us on Patreon. There are many other ways to support the show, including buying books from the bookshop site, either the books from the authors we interview or any book you like. bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And find our Cars Are Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/carsarecholesterol. And for anything else, including the Town Planning and Practice audiobook that plays like a podcast, visit theoverheadwire.com. You can also get that podcast from Libby at your public library. And finally, definitely sign up for the now 20-year-old daily newsletter at theoverheadwire.com, established in 2006, and our over 100,000 item link archive tagged by topic and city. We'll leave a YouTube explainer video in the show notes for that one as well. Or you can just keep listening and enjoying the show. We appreciate that too. You can find us mostly on Blue Sky and Mastodon, sometimes on Threads, Instagram, Flickr, YouTube, Substack, and LinkedIn if you want to connect, usually at the Overhead Wire, but with Flickr, it's called Transit Nerds. We've got some great stuff coming up in our 13th year of the podcast, so keep on listening for announcements. But for now, just enjoy the show. Laurel Paget-Seekins, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
I should say welcome back to the Talking Headways podcast. Before we get started, can you tell folks a little bit about yourself, maybe that didn't listen to the episode from 10 years ago, episode 101 actually, what you've been up to since then?
Since then. So at that point, I was working at the MBTA, running the data analytics team. And then I moved up at the MBTA and was the assistant general manager for policy for a couple of years, leading into COVID, which was a very stressful time to work at a transit agency and thinking about how we survive that event, and got extremely burnt out after what was then 6 years at the MBTA. And luckily was given a fellowship with the Leadership in Government Fellowship from Open Society Foundation. So got to have a sabbatical, basically, and really think through what I had learned in my time in government and how to share back some of those observations. And so I finished a board game that we had made while I was at the MBTA with my staff. I wrote a zine about working for equity with inside transit agencies, and I made a website about data and how transit agencies use data and how communities can engage with that, with transit data. Moved back to California, which is where I'm from. And then, was looking around for a job and ended up at this organization called Public Advocates, which is a 50-plus year civil rights nonprofit here in California. And I am not a lawyer, but they work heavily on transportation and transportation justice. So it seemed like a really good fit for my passion and my expertise.
Yeah. And I think we talked about this a little bit last time, but I'm curious, what was the first indication, maybe it was when you were really little, that you were interested in cities and transportation and urban policy stuff?
Oh, well, I actually grew up in very rural California, off the grid, completely off the grid, on a dirt road. So I came to the Bay Area as a young person. That was my introduction to cities, but it was very overwhelming. So I didn't really live in a city until I moved to Atlanta after... I guess I lived in a few other cities, but the first city I really kind of called home was Atlanta after college. And really then that was where I understood how critical, because I don't like to drive, public transit is for climate and energy and social justice and racial justice issues. And so that is how I got into transportation, was by moving to Atlanta and really seeing how critical transportation is like a lever in all of these other things that I thought was really important.
Atlanta must be such a different place than, I mean, I've driven through and I've been there a couple times, but I've never lived there. But I understand like there's a difference in terms of like the urban form and transportation policy and things like that.
Well, Atlanta has changed a lot since I lived there. So I moved there in like 2003, and it was very much a city that had urban poverty and, was a Black majority city still at that time. But since then has undergone a lot of change and gentrification and suburbanization of poverty. So all of that, as well as sort of was clearly the poster child for urban sprawl in many ways historically. So there were so many different ways that our urban and transportation policy showed up in the physical form of Atlanta that I think it made it like a really critical place to learn about transportation and urban planning and how that interconnects to all of these really deeply ingrained injustices in our society.
You created a transit board game, which I'm sorry we haven't played yet. I know you've been trying to get me to play it, and I feel bad that we haven't played it yet. And a zine on transit equity, like you mentioned, inside of agencies. I'm curious what the impetus was for the more kind of unconventional works of advocacy and thinking.
The board game came from working inside this agency, having been an advocate and an academic before, and starting to understand just how complex it was and how hard it was to see from the outside why things were so complicated. And so some colleagues and I were thinking about that. And we also had a lot of interns that would come co-op with us in our department. And so I was thinking about how to teach about the complexities of a transit agency or a government agency. And so the game became an idea of like, oh, this would be a way to teach that. But it was also an idea of how to it became basically like a therapy tool for my team where we would make cards for the game based on things that happened to us as a way of having an outlet for them when we often didn't have power in the situation. And so it was kept alive by that, I think. And then we played it internally, but then tested it with other audiences to see if it would work with anyone and sort of made it a little less inside joke and more thinking about how you get things done in a really complex agency and how you help people understand what it takes to accomplish things.
Was there anything you learned from making the game that maybe like brought some new things to your attention?
Well, I mean, one thing I learned is that there's a whole community of board game makers
there are.
Who are very dedicated to making board games and thinking about how board games work. And that was not what I was coming from. And it was interesting because they were like, well, this is kind of a really niche, like kind of boring game in their minds because it took so long to do anything. And I was like, no, that's the point. That's what I'm trying to have people understand. And then the zine, I think, came from having grown up in the 90s and, pre-internet days. And then so sort of maybe a little bit of nostalgia, but also just thinking about free-form ways to share information. And I actually made it like a physical zine. It is now available on the internet, but for the first year or two, it was only available in like a print.
It wasn't on the internet, but it was in print.
Yeah.
Well, I found the zine super informative. I wish I had read it earlier, actually. And the power dynamics part was super, super interesting, especially the specifics detailing agency staffs and the pressures they're under or the pressures they get from the outside, inside, the power dynamics from inside as well. And so that was really fascinating to me, especially as somebody who's generally on the outside, right? I've never been on the inside of an agency. I worked for a nonprofit that worked with agencies, but never inside.
Yeah, I feel like one of the biggest lessons I took away from working in an agency was how what made me the most effective inside the agency was to some extent the expertise that I had, but more so my experience as an organizer and as someone who thought about coalition building, thought about power, thought about how to solve problems in collective ways, to build consensuses in which was really like a hierarchical situation, a hierarchical organization where many, many people in different parts of the organization felt very disempowered. And so I was trying to create processes within that structure that would allow people to feel less disempowered so that we could collectively solve some problems that sort of crossed silos within the agency. And that was part of what I feel most proud about my work in an agency was being able to advance some very difficult projects, not just inside the agency, but working also with community advocates and writers and bringing those perspectives together to try to, implement some things that really could benefit people.
Yeah. It just makes me think of a lot of the things that's been bubbling up a little bit lately. I mean, Carter Lavin released his book recently, and a lot of this is kind of along the same lines in terms of the power dynamics, thinking about how you get to yes in terms of like the process of transit service or improvements or long-term projects, et cetera. Just fascinating. It's also interesting because like of late, there's been discussion about foundations, which are small but very powerful parts of this ecosystem and their specific role in advocacy. And I know that you did some work for Transit Center, and they've been talking about how they're going to divest or at least spend down all of their money. There's other folks that I've read about in like Next City and other places that have said like, well, I work for a foundation and I don't think they should exist anymore. I just find that interesting too, thinking about it from your standpoint of the inside the agency and the outside processes and kind of this discussion that's going on about just the specific type of organization that exists and that funds a lot of advocacy groups. It funds the outside game, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I think that change happens from the tension that comes from sort of the support and accountability from the outside and the inside and pushing on the power structure to make change. And so now I've been on all the sides, right? So I was an advocate, I was in academia, I was inside an agency, and now I'm back as an advocate and sort of being able to see what the different roles are. And then within and I think I talked about this in the zine as well, within the advocacy community, there's also different roles. Like there's a whole ecosystem of organizations, and that requires funding for that ecosystem of organizations. And one of the fascinating things that I noticed coming from Boston and then coming to the Bay Area is that I can kind of map the organizations onto each other across the cities. That like there's roles that different organizations play, whether how closely they work with an agency, are they sort of insiders, are they mostly outsiders, or there's organizations like public advocates that are using legal tools versus power building grassroots organizations. There's a whole spectrum and they all seem needed. But there has to be a way that they are able to sustain themselves in order to do that tension with the folks trying to make change inside of agencies to be successful.
Yeah, and that's always the hard part because you can't always rely on people's shoestring budgets and, the lack of funding. I know that, it's hard to make change when you have to do it on weekends and nights and things like that if you don't have full-time folks that are working on things. And so the money part comes in, and that is part of the whole ecosystem, the issues that come about.
Yeah.
Yeah. Last time we chatted, like in person, I think, you also gave a bit of thought to the public sector workforce and the ideas of capacity for agencies and what's the way to move that forward. Because during the pandemic specifically, even afterwards, we're having trouble attracting workers to drive buses, to be part of the agency experience. And I'm wondering your thoughts on that specifically, too, because you wrote a report for Transit Center and you've been thinking about that a bit, too.
Yes. So one of the things that I realized working at the MBTA is that we were what I jokingly call on a crisis treadmill. Mm-hmm. The sort of amount of crisis would change, but we were always in crisis. And that creates a mentality such that if you're not in crisis, you still feel like you are, because it's sort of in your body, in your ethos, in your culture of how you work as an organization. And I think transit agencies are particularly prone to this because it is a 24-hour operation where, there are life and death decisions that can be made and emergencies can happen. So that takes a toll on people. And the physical act of like driving a bus takes a toll on people. And so I think that public sector workers, even before the pandemic, were under a lot of stress. The pandemic added a layer of stress, and then we didn't, I think, fully account for that and figure out how to address that. And then we have now entered another layer of, attacks on public sector workers with the Trump administration, where, there are even some folks are intentionally saying that is what they came in to do, right?
Yeah,
is to
right.
create fear and trauma in the public sector workforce, especially for the federal government. So I feel like there's public sector workers are under tremendous amounts of stress, and it has to be addressed at some point, because part of this tension, right, is that we need government to perform in order for people to feel like it can work. And part of what this project, the sort of Trump administration project, is doing is trying to convince people, or building off a long-term project of trying to convince people the government doesn't work. we know government can work, but in order for it to work, we have to invest in it and we have to have people who are trying to figure out how to make it work. And that's becoming increasingly hard given the pressures that public sector workers are under. I can give an example of, I have been trying to get a FOIA request from the Federal Transit Agency for like 9 months now. And it took months and months and months to even get a response. And finally getting someone on the phone, and they're basically said, almost no one works here anymore. It's going to take like another 4 months to get you what you're asking for, which totally blatant violation of the FOIA law. But I can have some sympathy with the fact that I believe it to be true that they don't have a lot of capacity anymore. But the FOIA request actually is to try to understand, what are all of these existing Title VI complaints and how have they been resolved so that we can understand the impact of the changes that the Trump administration is trying to make. But we can't even get the basic data.
Yeah. That public capacity thing has been interesting to me too. Zach Liskow and his team wrote that report looking at like road building. And they said that, basically if you have competent and experienced engineers, you actually can reduce the cost of road building. And if you don't, then it makes the cost go up. So if you're cost cutting by getting rid of staff, you're actually making the cost of building things go higher, right? And so since the 70s, 80s, you have had this reduction in public capacity and government capacity to do these works. And so, while they've been cutting staff, we've been paying more and more and more for constructing projects and building things. And so I want to go back to there a little bit because I think that that's like an important point, and we'll get into Title VI in a second. But I just want to make that point because I feel like we do need to start thinking more about how we can kind of push back on this discussion about, we don't need the public sector or we don't need a government to work, which is truly, as you mentioned, very false. But it is, like you mentioned, a long-term project and frustrating at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it costs more because people are making money, right? Like there's another layer to it, which is like there are people who have a financial interest in doing that work in the private sector. So the money is being spent and it's going somewhere. So there's also a struggle that is connected to, money and politics and all of these other issues to build up the capacity of the state to do work so that it doesn't become government funding being siphoned off to private sector entities that are doing it less efficiently while painting the government employees as being inefficient.
Right. Yeah. Well, so I want to get to what you're working on now. Basically, US DOT has rescinded regulations requiring disparate impact analysis, which is how we challenge programs that harm protected groups. I'm not going to ask you why you did this because you were talking about that a second ago, but I will ask you about the pattern this fits in terms of getting rid of equity and social justice processes.
So just one minor correction. They haven't quite rescinded it yet. So this is the federal bureaucracy is set up such that we got a window to know, Trump issued an executive order in April of last year, basically ordering the federal agencies to rescind the regulations for disparate impact and to stop enforcing them in the active cases. And so that has been working its way through the federal government. The Department of Justice rescinded theirs in December. And then we got a notice basically that the US DOT is about to rescind theirs. And it looked like they were going to do it without even allowing any public comment. So that is what we think is going to happen any day now. But we worked with Latifah Simon's office, my congressional rep in the East Bay, and 13 Congress members wrote a letter to US DOT asking that they not rescind them, but if they did, that they would do public comment. So we're hoping that that letter is going to change their mind and they're going to release them in the proper standard way that requires notice and comment.
Is there any punishment for not doing it the right way or putting in the Federal Register and making sure that it comes out correctly?
They're putting in the Federal Register. So we'll see it in the Federal Register when they release it. There's a federal law called the APA, Administrative Procedure Act, maybe, that's where there could be violations of how they do it. So, there's considerations about whether to do those types of challenges, but the Trump administration seems to be violating the APA all over the place in terms of how they're releasing these regulations.
So I want to go back a second for listeners. Can you explain Title VI and some of the history and Civil Rights Act and all that stuff?
Yeah, so Title VI is a shorthand we use for Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So a landmark piece of legislation that came out of the civil rights movement. And the Title VI part is the part of the law that bans discrimination for race, color, national origin for programs that are funded by the federal government. So there's other parts of the law, but this is the part of the law that impacts programs that are funded by the federal government. So that's how it gets into local transit agencies and transportation departments that receive federal funding, which almost all of them do. So that is the basis of the law. And then from that, federal agencies enact regulations that lay out how they're going to implement a law. So that is what the USDOT has, regulations that implement the law. And then because USDOT is so large, the Federal Transit Administration has what's called a circular that tells transit agencies exactly how they have to implement the law. But effectively, what is at issue here is that you can have direct discrimination, where it's very clear that the intent, that it's an indiscriminatory intent, or you could have what's called disparate impact, which is showing that there's a disparate impact to a law, even if it looks on the face of it that it does not have a discriminatory intent. And there's a whole, body of case law and regulations that are embedded, and that the Trump administration's executive order didn't undo that. So there's still legal precedent for disparate impact, and it still is valid in court, but that essentially what disparate impact does is it sets up a different sort of legal standard where you can do statistical analysis to say, does this policy have a disparate impact on protected classes? And if it does, then you have to check to make sure that there is a legally legitimate business interest to do that. And if there isn't, then it isn't allowed. But then if you have a legitimate business interest, you then also have to check that there isn't a less discriminatory way to achieve that interest. So it's a sort of series of checks to make sure that there isn't discrimination in how federal funding is used.
Can you give me an example? I know you have a number of examples from the Bus Riders Union in Los Angeles, from the Oakland Airport Connector here in the Bay Area. I'm curious if you can give me an example of how projects might come forth, or a program might come forth, and then someone might say this has a disparate impact on communities of color. How would the process look, to give a example?
So just clarifying, I am not a lawyer, so that's just my non-lawyer explanation of things. Just to give a little more legal context, is that so initially there was the right for private action for individuals to sue around disparate impacts. And so the Los Angeles Bus Riders Union filed a suit against LAMTA because they were taking funds that had been being used for bus service, and they were raising bus fares at the same time while investing sort of a similar amount of money in building out rail capacity that was going to serve wider communities. And so they did a lawsuit, and there was basically a settlement, a consent decree, where LAMTA had to add more bus service, work on addressing bus overcrowding, create an affordable weekly bus pass, invest in new buses. So this was an example where the law was used. Then after that, there was a Supreme Court case called Alexander v. Sandoval in 2001 that ended the right for people to file suits around Title VI. So after that, the mechanism that people could use is to file a complaint with the federal government. And so you can file a Title VI complaint with the Federal Transit Agency, the Federal Highway Administration, if you think that there's a disparate impact over a policy. And just, can we sort of back up for 1 second to sort of talk about transportation and civil rights? Yeah, I think it's useful to understand why civil rights and transportation is so intertwined in our country. I think that has to do with the fact that both mass transit is the site of integration, right? It's a site where people shared public space, but also transportation is a way that segregation is broken down by people being able to travel across parts of a region. And so transportation infrastructure can both be used to break down segregation. It also historically, in the case of highways, and sometimes transit even, used to divide neighborhoods, to create barriers between neighborhoods. And so one of the reasons why disparate impact analysis is so important is to be able to sort of illustrate not just where and how people might not be getting the access for transportation, but also the burdens of transportation infrastructure more heavily falling on minority, Black and brown neighborhoods in a lot of cases around highway infrastructure. So some of the sort of Other examples are ways that Title VI has been used to push back on the negative impacts of a highway project, like pollution, flooding, displacement from businesses, homes, historical Black churches being threatened by highway projects. So it is both about the benefits of transportation and the burdens that transportation infrastructure creates.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. There's, a whole history of, obviously, like you said, the highway movement, breaking neighborhoods in half, but also even transit construction projects. I mean, we can talk about the Oakland Airport connector in a second, but I immediately thought back to like Atlanta when they were building MARTA and offering up bus service to suburbs that were more Black neighborhoods. And so even during, the construction of BART going through West Oakland, there's those types of things as well. So it's not, just coded as highway versus transit. It's how these projects actually impact the communities that they pass through.
Exactly. And so it really is about what communities are bearing the burden of projects and getting the benefit from them. And often transportation projects are designed to benefit people going through neighborhoods and not the people who live in that neighborhood. That's how you get speed, right, is by creating transportation infrastructure that, whether it's an arterial that, creates safety problems, or a highway or a rail line, a heavy rail line, that it creates a barrier, it creates pollution, noise pollution, all sorts of impacts that are designed to have people travel fast through a neighborhood and not to benefit the people who have to live with those burdens.
Yeah. Let's talk about the Oakland Airport connector. At the time, I remember it was very controversial from my standpoint anyways. I know that for some folks it might not have been, but BART eventually built it. But they were trying to build a ropeway, basically, a tramway that was pulled by ropes that went from the Coliseum BART station to the Oakland International Airport. So what role did public advocates and others play in discussing like why this actually had an impact on the communities, because it didn't stop anywhere in between those two endpoints?
Yeah, so I was not a public advocate at the time, but public advocates working with some community organizations filed I think initially, did the due diligence of reaching out to BART and MTC and trying to figure out what analysis had been done and understanding the impacts of this project, but then eventually filed a complaint with Federal Transit Administration. And I believe it was being funded with stimulus money after Obama was elected, was where the federal funds were going to come from. And as you mentioned, the project was really intentionally designed for a certain type of transit rider, which was to get people to the Oakland Airport. And
replacing a bus that served that destination previously, the destinations.
Right. And so it was both the service design and also that it had a very high fare, which was maybe within the reach of an airport traveler, but wouldn't be like a sustainable way to travel if your job was at the airport and you needed to make that trip every day. And, the demographics have probably changed a little bit, but the, neighborhoods around the Coliseum BART station were majority Black and Latino. And so the argument was that those neighborhoods would not be getting the benefit of this federal investment because it wouldn't be serving their needs, which would be to access not just jobs at the airport, but along the corridor, because there's a lot of like logistics and hospitality jobs, around an airport. So it would be going through their neighborhood, but it wouldn't be benefiting them. And the complaint sort of hinged on the federal government basically asked BART to submit some required analysis. They didn't do it. And so the FTA administrator at the time decided to pull the federal funding from the project. So there wasn't like a clearly like this project is discriminatory. It ended up being that they didn't complete the required analysis and that's why the funding was pulled. But I do think it is a good example of how if we think about like that analysis, it's like, okay, so this project was designed. We think it has a disparate impact. Is there a legitimate reason to build a connector to the airport? Sure. But is there a less discriminatory way it could have been built, right? So that's the part of like, we can, I think, all imagine a way it could have been built that would have gotten people to jobs as well as people to the airport in a reliable way. And at the same time, as you mentioned, like, because this was right after the Great Recession, bus service was being threatened as well, that you would end up in a situation where you had this high cost fast way to get to the airport for travelers, but reduction in service for people who lived along the corridor and needed to travel to jobs and other places along that corridor on that bus service. As you mentioned, the project did get built with state and local funding. And there is a bus line. I often take it from the Oakland Airport the 73 that still travels in that corridor, but it definitely could have more regular service on it.
Yeah. I've taken the Oakland Airport connector a couple of times, but I also remember at the time thinking like there's other things along that corridor, and there's like rental car stations and stuff like that you can't get to because the line doesn't stop. And the weird choice of a ropeway as well was another thing that was frustrating at the time. But also, I read the letter from FTA, and it was kind of a blast from the past when I was like reading it, like looking at all these names on there, like Dorval Carter, who ended up being the head of the CTA, and Peter Rogoff, who ended up being the head of Sound Transit, and now is not there anymore. Anyways, it was like a memory hole going back in time. I also want to chat about Houston because Houston's near and dear to my heart. I grew up in Houston and know a little bit about what's going on with I-45 and the expansion of highways all over the state. We had Megan Kimball on the show to talk about her book related to those expansions. And we've also had other folks on who were a part of the process for trying to get it stopped. But I'm curious about that project specifically and the complaint that was filed and the continuation of freeway expansions, even though we know they're harmful.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think there's any example where a Title VI complaint was able to fully stop a highway expansion project. I think most of the examples that I've found, they were able to win better mitigation for the surrounding communities. And in a lot of cases, they were resolved to what's called a voluntary resolution agreement. So there was no admitting that it was discriminatory, but there was a willingness on the part of, the state DOT, in this case, Texas DOT, to agree to some mitigations in order to keep the federal funding coming. And so that was the case in this Houston project. During the Biden administration, Federal Highway Administration, signed this agreement with them, asking that they include more mitigation in the design of that project, including, interestingly enough, some funding for affordable housing and like thinking about other ways that, what does it mean for people to be displaced? Because as we increasingly think about, the housing crisis, displacing housing for highway projects, which is something that is currently still happening. There was a recent bill that was passed in California to sort of require Caltrans to release data to even sort of document and show those impacts. So thinking about like all the different types of mitigation that could be required that we're losing if we lose this ability to challenge the disparate impact of projects.
Do you think there's ever a chance that you could get to a point where you could kill off a highway expansion project? We had the right folks in place. Even, Secretary Buttigieg got involved, folks in his office got involved. And so we had a friendly administration, but it's still kind of pushed through. So I'm wondering, what are the stars aligning needs that have to happen in order to get something like that killed off?
I don't know. I think, there's so many interests, especially in a state like Texas, that keeps pushing highway projects. And I think the other tension, and this is not a place where I'm an expert, is around sort of how much power does the federal government have to tell states what they can do with their transportation money, right? So Title VI is one example where it's you can't discriminate, but they still have a lot of leeway to
with the Oakland Airport connector, they still built the line, right? They still used local money to do it. So I guess there's that, but I'm just hopeful, especially in a place like Texas where they're spending like $20 billion. They have a $55 billion or $100 and something billion plan to expand highways in the state. And it just doesn't seem like a very useful way to spend money. And, this is influenced also by my recent trips to China, where high-speed rail, they've built 50,000 miles of high-speed rail. And it seems like, we've actually run to the end of our economic development potential for highway expansion. So we maybe should take it in a different direction if we want some value out of the money that we're spending.
Yes, I think that so many systems have been built from thinking about who's benefiting and the corporate or the construction interests, as well as how DOTs are designed and sort of the types of thinking inside of DOTs. All of these systems are set up on sort of autopilot towards continuing to build highways. So it's a sort of very big, going back to the beginning of this conversation of how do you make change inside of a government agency? It's a very, very big project, even in a state like California, to think about how do we sort of change the mindset of a state DOT to actually be not a highway building department.
Right. What's happening with Clipper 2 and cash payments?
Sure. So this is an example that came up here in Oakland recently. So as part of the Clipper rollout, there were some decisions that were made by the region about the functionality of the system, right? And one of which is that you can use your contactless credit card to pay and not have to have the special Clipper card, which is very useful for a lot of riders, especially visitors. And then also, agencies were able to make their own fare policy changes with the new software. And one of the functionalities is something that is called fare capping, or, weekly, daily maximums. There's many ways to try to explain it, but effectively, instead of having to buy a pass up front for a week or a month, you pay as you go. And then if you hit that cap, then you effectively bought a pass and the rest of your rides are free. So it is a great fare policy. It has particular benefits for low-income riders who may not have the cash flow at the upfront of a month to buy a monthly pass or a weekly pass. So on the face of it, great fare policy. AC Transit adopted it. However, it's only available if you have a Clipper card or you have a contactless bank card, and not for riders who are paying in cash. And there still are a lot of riders who pay in cash on AC Transit. And part of the reason why that is that there are very few places to add money to your Clipper card in large parts of the AC Transit Service District, in particular in East Oakland. But if you look at the map of where the Clipper card ad locations are, they're, clustered mostly around BART stations and downtown Berkeley, downtown Oakland. So a lot of people still pay cash for AC Transit, and those people, the current data is hopefully going to be released soon, but the pre-pandemic ridership data showed that those folks paying cash were disproportionately Black and Latino. And what this has set up is that if you're paying in cash, you can buy a daily pass on the bus for $6 a day, but you can't buy a weekly pass. And so if you bought a daily pass every day on the bus, if you're a very frequent bus rider, you would be paying $17 more a week than what the person with the Clipper card to get to that weekly pass. So that seems like a disparity. It's a disparity that it's like hurting the people who need it the most. There are a lot of unbanked riders. If you look at East Oakland, there's also, gaps where there aren't banks even. And so we're sort of layering a bunch of policy failures on top of each other to create this situation where the people who can least afford to pay are theoretically going to be paying more. So AC Transit did a Title VI analysis for this change. I would argue they didn't do it accurately. This is the type of situation where if we had faith in the federal government, we would file a complaint. But even if these regulations don't get rescinded, there's not a lot of faith that there would be a investigation or any enforcement of Title VI in this administration. So we're left in a situation where there are very few tools under federal law to do anything about this. I will add that the sort of Title VI, you can't discriminate in federally funded programs, exists in California law for state-funded programs. So we do have the same protection under state law in California. So part of what we are investigating now is thinking about how can we help transit agencies understand what their requirements are under California law to ensure that there aren't disparate impacts to their decisions.
It makes me think also about, and I'm not trying to take it off on a tangent, but our dependence on automobiles. We built our built environment such that most places outside of major cities, you have this requirement to drive around in this 2-ton metal box. And so that requirement of having that to participate in society is now kind of coming down to the lower levels as more agencies and others require you to have a phone or some sort of technology in order to participate. And so it seems like there's a resilience or a redundancy necessary to have these systems work better. You can't just as we found out in the power outage in San Francisco, right? All the Waymos just went down because they didn't have a secondary system to make them move out of the way or pass them through lights that weren't working. And so I find that frustrating too, is we're requiring people to have phones, we require people to have cars, we require this technology, but we don't have a redundancy to allow us to operate, smoothly for everybody.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So KQED did a story on this Clipper card situation, and they went and talked to riders in a major transit hub in East Oakland. And one of the riders they found was staying in shelter. She had a Clipper card on her phone, but her phone battery was dead. And she had money, but it was a check, and she needed to go to a bank to cash the check, to put the money then on the phone on the Clipper card. And she had to take a bus because there wasn't a bank branch near Eastmont Transit Center. So she had to overpay in cash to be able to go to the bank, hopefully charge her phone, cash the check, add the money to the account so she could get money on her Clipper card. It's like we're creating all of these hurdles for the people who have the most hurdles in their life. It is very expensive to be poor in this country, and this is sort of adding on to that. While at the same time, like, I understand the arguments for not wanting a lot of cash to be added on board buses because it slows them down, right? So there's a lot of reasons why it's like we want to incentivize people not to be using cash on board buses, but we have to create ways that people can still access the lower fares or other ways we're trying to incentivize that. Otherwise, it's just an inequitable policy.
It reminds me, I sold my car in like 2012-ish, and the person flew from Denver to Oakland, gave me $2,000 in cash. My bank branch was like south of Millbrae, so like outside of, and so in order to get the money that I got for selling my car to the bank, I had to rent a car to get there. So I had to get a zip card just to deposit the money. And so it's like kind of a similar thing. Like there's these systems that overlap each other that are required to be a participant in society that just don't seem to work sometimes. And it's frustrating.
Well, I think one of the things that I sort of going back to the beginning of our conversation about sort of my insights working in government is that government needs to be designed to work for everybody, right? Even the people whose experience of the world is less frequent, right? So if you think sort of like the statistical distribution, who are at the ends of the distribution, whose experience is less frequent, like a lot of sort of like efficiency, private sector thinking is like, well, let's just serve the middle of the distribution. Like we don't need to do the extra work to serve the folks on the edges. But government, it's imperative that they serve, right, the folks whose experience is less common for whatever reason. And that requires more work. And it requires sometimes things might look less efficient because you're doing and designing your programs to work for everyone and not just for the median person. And this came up for me when I was implementing a program for low-income youth, a low-income youth fair in Boston. And it was like, oh, right, we created a program for some organizations, but then we had to set up a whole different system just for the small group of organizations for whom that system didn't work. And I was like, right, that is a lot of work, but that's exactly what I'm here for. That is exactly what my job is to figure out how to make this work for everyone and not just the easiest use case, right? Yeah. It's like, what are the edge cases and how do we make it work for the edge cases? It became kind of my like mantra.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I've been thinking also lately about the discussion about running government like a business. And usually it's about money and it's about like inputs and outputs of like the budgets and stuff like that. But running government like a business is like you were talking about, like businesses only have to cater to their market, not necessarily to everybody. And so government isn't a business. It can never be a business. It's actually a public service. And so it's a natural monopoly, as it were. And so I feel like that's just another kind of discussion we need to have about the way that we run government and who government's actually for.
Yeah, and I think that this Clipper card example is a good one just to show that when we think about designing these systems, how do we make sure we're designing it for the people who need it the most in mind? And like, what are the tools that we have, Title VI being one of them, to check for that, right? And so part of what's going to be taken away if these regulations get rescinded is the requirement that agencies do those checks at the front end, the like preventative checks. So we've talked about sort of the complaints, but the other part of Title VI, the requirements in the Federal Transit Administration circular, is that agencies do these checks before they make the decision, right? So that it isn't like we've created this harm and then maybe years later it's fixed. It is, let's make sure that we're checking to make sure that our decisions don't have a disparate impact before we implement them. And so for fare changes, for service changes, as well as service quality. So like there's a requirement that they monitor for overcrowding and for reliability to make sure that the bus lines that are serving Black and brown neighborhoods and communities of color aren't less reliable, aren't older buses that pollute more, aren't more crowded. So those are like key critical requirements. The other like major fundamental requirement is to gather the data in order to do that analysis. And so without that data, we can't do the checks. We can't determine how far we are from equity.
We just released this morning a podcast with Stephen Krim of New York MTA, and we talked about the data collection process for congestion pricing and like how much you have to go back and how much data doesn't exist that has to be either figured out or created or, collected. It's really, really important.
Yeah, and that requirement for data. So when I was at the MBTA, I ran the team that did the data collection for the demographic data of our riders. We also gathered, how people are getting access to transit. Like, it was a very rich data set that the only requirement that transit agencies do is this federal regulation that we're hopefully not about to lose. But that data is then used for all sorts of analysis of thinking about for transit planning, service planning, as well as these equity analyses. And my fear is that without the federal requirement, especially as agencies face budget crises, they will stop doing that data collection because it is expensive to collect that level of survey data. And I think there's some, innovations that are happening of trying to figure out how to, collect it more online and less paper surveys. So you don't have to do like manual data entry and all the things that, come with that. But it is a big investment, but it is a super critical investment in being able to understand who your riders are, how they're getting to transit, how they're using transit, how they're paying, and all of the rich analysis that can be done from it.
It goes back to that discussion, public sector capacity. If you lose it, it's more expensive, right? It feels like it's more expensive because you're losing that information and all that stuff that is necessary.
And that data is like a public good in and of itself, right? Because then the agency releases it and researchers can use it and advocates can use it and all sorts of people can use it. And it is very, very, very hard for anybody else to collect, right?
Yeah. There's no private like benefit of collecting all that data, but there is a benefit overall of having it.
Yeah.
So how can we push back against this change? Is there any way that is there somebody we need to write? Is there something we need to do? It seems like they're set in stone on their actions, but.
Yeah. So if the congressional letter works and they do release it with public comment, then there will be an opportunity to do public comment, which isn't really important, even if you feel like, they're just going to do what they want, to build the record that could be used in a legal challenge, but also just to really demonstrate that this is really important and for people to understand how important this is nationally in transportation as well as in other sectors, because they're doing these rollbacks across all of the sectors. And this disparate impact analysis is important in housing, in employment, in education, in lending, in all sorts of ways where there's like a history of discrimination in our country.
Yeah.
So nationally, hopefully there will be a chance to do public comment and there'll be a chance for people to talk about why this is important with decision makers. In California, because as I mentioned before, California does have the Title VI equivalent in state law, there's more to be done to make sure that we are following it, that we're using it. So California has that requirement, but they have some regulations that explain how agencies need to not discriminate and what it means, but we don't have the requirements for the preventative analysis for transit agencies. We don't have the requirements for the data collection. So there's more that we can do in California to replicate the protections that we have federally and to make sure that the transit agencies aren't taking disparate impacts and that we have the data to check. So there is an enforcement mechanism currently in California law. So people could file a complaint with Caltrans, who oversees the State Transportation Development Act funding that goes to transit agencies. But that is also hasn't really been tested. I did a public records request with them. They just sent it back to me today saying they have no records of any procedures of what they would do if someone filed a complaint under this section of California law. So it's really sort of untested because we've been relying on federal civil rights law for so long that we have to figure out and build the capacity within California agencies to have the guidance, have the enforcement mechanisms, and invest again in the state capacity to do the enforcement, to do the investigations that previously we relied on the federal government to do. And other states are currently working with national partners on this. Other states are currently working through. There's a few other states that have the same Title VI law in their state code, but there's some other states that are working on it right now of trying to pass them. Massachusetts is one, the Boston connection. So I'm still working with folks there. Maryland as well is the ones I can think of off the top of my head. But there's more that we can do at the state level.
Where can folks find out more about what you all are doing?
At Public Advocates. We have a website, publicadvocates.org, and are on social media. And yeah, we're hoping to be, as this regulation is rolled out, talking to decision makers and the media and anyone who will listen to understand just how important this is and the impacts of this and how important this tool is to addressing this very long history of discrimination and segregation in transportation.
And where can folks find you if you wish to be found?
If I wish to be found, I do have a website that I have not posted on in forever, Laurel in Transit, and that's where the zine is. And then there's...
You get the board game there?
The board game is out of print currently, but you can see pictures of it. And then I do have another website, which is the Transit Data Primer, which we haven't really talked about, but I also built during my fellowship, that just talks about different types of transit data sets, the importance of qualitative and quantitative data, how they need to be used together. This survey data we're just talking about is an example of, a mix of qualitative and quantitative data and how important it is for how transit agencies can use data. So that is transitdataprimer.org.
I'll check it and put it in the show notes. Well, Laurel, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks so much for coming in to the office, and appreciate you coming in.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to chat about this critical issue, but how it ties together with all the other work that I've done and going to continue to do.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters who support this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. You can support the show as always by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Sign up for our almost 20-year-old newsletter as well by visiting theoverheadwire.com, or check out the show notes for merch or other opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways. Hey everybody, we're past the main credits. Here we are at the end of the show. But I do want to give a shout out to some of our $10 a month or more Patreon supporters who've been helping the show along with your very, very generous support. If you've made it this far, you're probably a really big listener and reader. We really appreciate that. When I get new supporters, I'll update this section, so I hope that happens often. First names only, but big thanks to Andrew, Ben, Derek, Gabrielle, Glenn, Greg, James, Jeremy, Jim, Joseph, Catherine, Mao, Marcus, Matthew, Mike, Nicholas, Abraham, Oliver, Steve, Abby, Ed, Matthew, and recently added Sylvia. Everybody who listens to this show and reads the newsletter is much, much appreciated. I just wanted to give our biggest supporters a little extra love and recognition. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you next time.